La hache l'atteint au milieu de sa phrase en plein visage. Le couperet, épais, s'enfonce de biais dans sa bouche ouverte et lui la ferme. La conversation suit sa pente naturelle. Ni structure proprement dite, ni sujet précis, ni logique interne, ni sentiment. Des mots, c'est tout. Mais des mots qui se chevauchent pour la plupart, comme dans une bande-son mal montée. « Salut, je suis Pat Batman », dis-je, tendant la main, remarquant au passage mon reflet dans le miroir accroché au mur, avec un sourire de satisfaction. Puis, très vite, le sang commence à couler doucement de chaque côté de sa bouche. Et quand je retire la hache, manquant d'arracher Owen de sa chaise par la tête pour le frapper, puis Sabrina embrasse Sabrina pleine langue, tandis que je continue à la bouffer, la bouche, une seule, le menton, une sombre vérité. Personne n'est à l'abri de rien, et rien n'est racheté. Je suis innocent pourtant. Le mal, est-ce une chose que l'on est, ou est-ce une chose que l'on fait ?
Good evening. One of the most controversial and shocking books to be published for many years, American Psycho by Eastona Ellisa was published in America 2 weeks ago. It's writing like this that has caused such offence. Some have called for the book to be banned.
It's almost as if the author kept saying to himself, how much feces can I smear on the wall before Mommy and Daddy really get angry? And Mommy and Daddy got angry.
The book is a nightmarish vision of New York life in the 80s, seen through the eyes of serial killer Patrick Bateman, a yuppie with a predilection for torture and murder.
I found the book a failure. I thought that the characterizations were flat and simply serving to be vehicles for Ellisa's negative obsessions.
I think the book is shit. Ellisa's real crime is not to debase women, not to debase people, not to debase little animals on the street, but to debase the imagination. That's what I can't forgive him for.
We'll think without
Do you think
trace.
he has got a moral context for it? Is that
This is not a poor little book. Major publishing hype. This is not...
So pointless, so themeless, so everythingless is this novel, except in stupefying details about expensive clothing, food and bath products, that were it not the most loathsome offering of the season, it certainly would be the funniest. Of course, you will be stunned to learn that the book goes nowhere. Characters do not exist, therefore do not develop. Bateman has no motivation for his madness. No plot intrudes upon the pages. Bateman is never brought to justice, suggesting that even justice was bored. Nor is Mr. Ellis.
If you would read the book again today, you would not change your mind.
If I would read the book today, I would hang myself.
American Psycho is going to be on my headstone. You know, it's going to be. There's no way I can write anything more well-known than that book. It is funny, and I will admit it to you candidly, to be talking about Patrick Bateman 30 years after the book was published. I thought I was done with him. I thought it was done with Patrick Bateman in December of 1989 when I finished the book. And I thought that my experimental novel would sell 5,000 copies. And it would be something that I'm glad I got out of my system and never have to deal with it again.
Il ne m'était jamais venu à l'esprit que les gens puissent être bons, ou qu'un homme pût changer, ou que le monde pût être meilleur au travers de ce plaisir que l'on prend à tel sentiment, telle apparence ou tel geste, à recevoir l'amour ou l'amitié de son prochain. Rien n'est affirmatif. Le terme de bonté d'âme ne correspondait à rien. C'était un cliché vide de sens, une sorte de mauvaise plaisanterie. La surface, la surface, la surface. Voilà ce dans quoi on trouve une signification. C'est ainsi que je vis la civilisation, un colosse déchiqueté.
I was very attracted to horror movies when I was a kid in the 1970s. The movies were a reflection of the secret world that I guess I lived in, because on the surface of it, it was a fairly, upper middle class, fairly standard family situation. But below that surface of the kind of perfect family, there was a lot of other things going on that weren't on the surface, that were hidden. Obviously, there were tensions in my parents' marriage. There was my father's alcoholism. There was also my understanding that I was gay, that I was different. And the horror movies I saw were a reflection of that. They got to the horror that was messing up the placid surface of the lives that we were trying to live. You never got backstories as to why things happened. You never knew why Reagan in The Exorcist was possessed or why the shark came to Amityville. It was all very unexplained. Just shit happens. All of these rules and all of these ways we were supposed to behave was just a kind of pose, a kind of act. The horror movies of that era did make me feel stronger, that I was rising towards something, that if I could sit through these movies and not be triggered by them or break down or run out of the theater, then I was becoming an adult.
Mon allégresse macabre a fait place à de l'amertume et je pleure sur moi-même. Je veux juste être aimé, maudissant la terre et tout ce qu'on m'a enseigné, les principes, les différences, les choix, la morale, le compromis, le savoir, l'unité, la prière. Tout cela se résumait à « adapte-toi ou crève ».
Brett was unusual. He would wear a suit to class. He was definitely more advanced in terms of being a writer and a thinker, unafraid of controversy. He was always larger than life in some way. You would just hear whatever, things about what maybe happened to Brett last night, or not even know if it's true or not. He would invent some gossip about somebody else that wasn't damning in any way, but just was odd. And I guess it's sort of like his means of playing with people's heads, or just entertaining himself. I'm not sure. While still at Bennington, the writer Joe McGinnis saw his work as an application to get into the class and said, "This is amazing," and already was showing it to his agent.
You could tell instantly from reading them that he was just a remarkable observer with a very distinctive style. About a year later, I started working at Simon & Schuster, and a manuscript shows up, a finished novel, which turned into Less Than Zero. It was autobiographical pieces about growing up in Los Angeles that just show a talent that can't be ignored.
You don't look happy.
But do I look good?
We got a very mixed reaction from the editorial board. One of the famous comments from one of the senior people there was, if we're going to publish a novel about coke-snorting zombies, then I guess this is the one we should publish.
I met Brett in 1984. His editor had given me a manuscript of Less Than Zero a few weeks before this, and I had read a few pages, and I just said, ah. My first impression when I picked up the book was, oh, he's just trying to be shocking, After I met Brett, and that night we went out for drinks, and we had a really good time. We bonded, I think. And so the next morning, I picked up the manuscript of Less Than Zero, and I read it. So I was impressed. I thought, this is a smart guy who thinks hard about fiction.
To write a book as good as Less Than Zero, when you're that age, that doesn't happen every generation or every 2 generations or every 3. I mean, when I talk about Brett being incredibly mature, he's precocious. as well as being mature, to see what's happening around him.
I knew after I read his book that what was happening to me was about to happen to him. You know, I was becoming famous, and I was you know, reading about myself every day, and I was besieged by the press and fans, and I knew that it would happen to him too. And I thought, well, I could help him a little, you know, and it did happen to him too.
I had moved to New York, which I had always planned to do. And yes, in 1987, there was a big change going on in New York. It was becoming gentrified to a degree. It was changing. It was still dirty. It was still the New York that I loved, that I wanted to go to in all the movies I saw from the 1970s. And I thought, that's really where I want to live. Or if it was in a Woody Allen movie, Woody Allen movies were very influential to me. I remember seeing Manhattan and thinking, that's the movie that really pushed me over and made me want to move to New York.
Chapter 1. He adored New York City. He idolized it all out of proportion. No, make that, he romanticized it all out of proportion. Better.
It was a very, very exciting time to be a writer. You know, in the 70s and the early 80s, fiction was not at the center of the culture. There wasn't, there were very few writers who captured the popular imagination. Rock and roll, TV, film were the dominant modes of pop discourse. And then suddenly, in the early mid-80s, you have a group of writers, as some journalists said, who made writing sexy again, who made fiction sexy again. It felt like we were very much at the center of the culture, and that, that center was located in New York at a really interesting moment when, you also had a sort of art and music scene, which was exciting. Everything was happening. It was the most beautiful girls and the most exciting conversation, and of course the best drugs, and we we sort of took advantage of our fame and our fortune. Probably some novels never got written because of that, but.
Novelty became something that was sort of a value in itself. The younger you were and the flashier you were, and the more you get on page 6, which is a gossip column in New York, it was regarded as a plus. And there's no question that Brett and Jay lived up to that image. That is, they were out partying all the time. They were, the subject of endless gossip. And in a cynical way, that was good for publishers, because publishers could say, we've got the next young, hot writer.
Brett, finding himself with all this cash all of a sudden, would take like 20 people out to dinner all the time, fanciest places. And he would also throw really fun parties, definitely at Christmas, you'd never know who you'd see at those parties. Just whoever was in the news at the moment was there, and he would cater it and have servers with giant angel wings and things like that.
We had many weird instances where people would literally mistake us for each other, as if we were in a Bret Easton Ellis novel where nobody could remember anybody's name. But yeah, and people would thank me for my Christmas party, but it wasn't me that gave the Christmas party, it was always Brett.
I was writing American Psycho during a time of my life where I had become a kind of literary celebrity. And I realized very early on that the person who was the celebrity wasn't me. And that I had been, for example, was being talked about and written about in ways that I knew wasn't true, that it wasn't the real Brett. But people's notions of me, a critic's idea of me, a journalist's take on me. And I got very scared briefly about, oh, I'm dead. The real Brett is dead, and this is the Brett that's going to take over. And did take over. And I did become the dark bad boy of American Letters or whatever, and especially more so with American Psycho, but already with Lesson Zero and The Rules of Attraction. Druggy, nihilistic, didn't care about anything, young people, discos, whatever. A lot of sex, a lot of drugs, et cetera, et cetera. And so, and it did begin to seep into the book.
Il est à peu près 4 heures de l'après-midi et je rentre de Central Park, où, non loin du zoo des enfants, là où j'ai tué le petit Mac Caffrey, j'ai jeté aux chiens qui passaient des morceaux de la cervelle d'Ursula. Tout le monde semble abattu dans la 5e avenue. Tout respire la déchéance. Des corps gisent sur les trottoirs, glacés, alignés sur des kilomètres. Certains bougent, la plupart sont inertes. L'histoire est en train de sombrer, et seuls quelques rares individus semblent vaguement conscients de la sale tournure que prennent les choses. Je remarque que la ligne des gratte-ciel a changé depuis peu, et lève un regard admiratif sur la Trump Tower, immense, miroitant avec orgueil dans la lumière de cette fin d'après-midi.
We've employed 5,000 construction workers. There'll be many people employed in running the building. Thousands of people are spending millions of dollars on New York City. Many of these very wealthy people have chosen Trump Tower. I think it's a vital step for New York.
Let me go a little further. There's nothing wrong with being rich.
I had already planned on writing American Psycho by the time I moved in New York, and I knew my next novel was going to be about Wall Street, about the guys on Wall Street. And so, when I got there, I really started going out with the Wall Street guys. The older brothers of my friends who were in their, I guess then, mid to late 20s, were making a lot of money. I wanted to know more about how it works. How do you make this much money?
In the 1980s and the Reagan eras, Wall Street became the left ventricle of capitalism, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Every once in a while in this country, the animal spirits get unleashed and then who knows what the hell happens, right? I think the 80s was one of those times. And then, you had the glorification of bankers and traders and Wall Street, and they were making all this money. And, at Lazar, there used to be a phrase, it's not enough for you to succeed. Others have to fail. You have to issue more. You have to do more and more and more. The culture definitely changed. It became much more of a consumption-oriented culture, and people were sort of celebrated for that,
I really didn't know that much about Wall Street or being a trader even. And then the book began to change when I realized that they weren't really that interested in telling me. Maybe they were a little bit, but mostly it was about their lifestyle. Which, in a way, when you look back at someone in their 20s, a man in their 20s, or even a woman, that is kind of an important thing. And your looks are important, and the way you hold yourself, and your bragging rights, and how much money you make, and who has the hottest girlfriend, and who has the nicest suit, and who has the nicest car, and who has the nicest apartment. All of that began to swirl around, and it was a reflection of the yuppie culture in that moment. And hanging out with those guys changed the book. It did change the book. It changed this very earnest novel in many ways about a young man on Wall Street who becomes, becomes slightly corrupted, loses his innocence, had a girlfriend, a lot of drugs, And then at the end, he decided to leave and walk away from it all. And like Clay at the end of Lesson Zero, like Sean at the end of The Rules of Attraction, it was going to form a kind of trilogy of young people in the 1980s. And that's what I thought it was going to be until one night I had dinner with a group of guys again, and it changed. I don't know why, and I can't explain it. In the middle of a dinner, I realized it so clearly. I thought, Patrick Bateman's going to be a serial killer. Or he's going to imagine that he's a serial killer. Oh, that was so strange. Why would this be? And then it just made perfect sense to me. I can't explain it. I can't explain to anybody why that became what I thought the book was going to be about. Something was going on in my unconscious, I guess, that made me make that connection.
I believe there is reason for both hope and optimism.
The other book was thrown out. This was a new book. And so I started to fool around with a voice. Could never picture a face, ever, when I was writing the book. I had no idea what he looked like. He was just this voice.
Un clochard auquel j'ai crevé les yeux, certain printemps, est assis en tailleur sur une couverture pouilleuse au coin de la 57e. Son nez est dans un tel état que je n'imagine guère que l'on puisse respirer au travers. J'ai sorti mon portefeuille pour faire semblant de laisser $1 dans le pot de café vide. Et je me dis soudain, pourquoi se donner cette peine? De toute façon, personne ne regarde, et surtout pas lui. Je retire le $.
Ce qui s'est probablement passé chez Bret Easton Ellis, c'est qu'il a trouvé une voix romanesque qui est très particulière dans ce livre et qui pour moi en fait la réussite, voix qu'on ne retrouve pas véritablement dans ses autres livres. Et cette voix lui a permis d'exprimer quelque chose qui est très profond en nous, qui est ce que j'appellerais la désempathie, le contraire de l'empathie. L'incapacité complète à ressentir ce que ressent l'autre. Mais cette désempathie, elle est très profondément ancrée en nous. Parce que même si, sous la protection du surmoi, de la société, nous essayons de nous mettre à la place de l'autre, fondamentalement, ça n'est pas le cas. Donc il y a quelque chose de très profond dans cette image violente qu'il nous renvoie de nous-mêmes.
There's very little about Patrick Bateman and I that we actually shared. On some sort of literary level, yeah, I guess so, in terms of both being unhappy to a degree in our circumstances. But I'm not a literary character. Patrick Bateman is a literary character I thought about for years, and I had plans for him. And there were things I wanted to explore. That was far more interesting than whatever my mild problems were as a kind of depressed celebrity walking around New York during the late 80s. But yeah, sure, we shared something. Being a person in a world where which you hate and you reject all of its values, but you have nowhere else to go. And so you're kind of trapped, and all you can hope for is that you don't go crazy.
L'œil éclaté pend hors de l'orbite et coule le long de sa joue. Mais il ne cesse de cligner des paupières. D'une main, je lui attrape la tête, la fais basculer en arrière. Puis, maintenant la paupière ouverte entre le pouce et l'index, je lève le couteau et enfonce la pointe de la lame dans l'orbite qui se remplit de sang. Puis incise l'œil lui-même en biais. Et comme il commence enfin à crier, je lui fends le nez en deux. Et le sang gicle.
When I read the book, I said, holy shit, this is going to be wild. I must admit, I was a little squeamish about the violence of American Psycho. And not only I wasn't the only one who's squeamish. Brett himself was. He saved all the violent scenes until the end. He wrote everything else first, and I remember trying to reach him for like several days. I couldn't reach him, and we talked, you know, all the time, and finally, you know, I heard from his agent, who was also my agent, that, you know, he was really depressed and freaking out because he was writing all these scenes, you know, in the course of like a couple of weeks, he was writing all these scenes. And so I remember going to his apartment and dragging him out to dinner to just get him away from, get him away from this stuff.
The highly respected publisher Simon & Schuster had intended to publish American Psycho this January. The official reason for Simon & Schuster's withdrawal was, quote, a matter of taste. However, 48 hours after they pulled out, Random House bought the rights.
I remember presenting the book to the marketing meeting at which there were salespeople, publicity people, and so on. I circulated some sample chapters ahead of time, and people were horrified. I wanted people to know absolutely what they were dealing with. And, you know, at a certain level, that must have been a mistake on my part. You know, maybe I thought they would read it with sophistication and understand what I understood about the book. That, yes, it was horrible, but it was also comic, it was satirical, it was, as I say, inviting the reader's complicity.
It was a big controversy, big controversy. A lot of people were very, very angry at Brett. You know, basically, people were saying that Brett was a misogynist and that he hated women and he got death threats, and it was pretty serious.
Il y a des extraits d'American Psycho qui paraissent dans deux magazines et déjà le scandale explose. Très peu de gens ont lu le livre, très peu de gens ont lu les épreuves d'un bout à l'autre, mais ça suffit, les extraits suffisent pour allumer la mèche du pétard qui va exploser avec protestation des associations féministes, insultes, menaces de mort, etc. On n'avait pas vu ça depuis très très longtemps quand même.
I was just horrified by the descriptions of violence that were contained in the book. And then on another level, as a feminist and as someone who works full-time for women's empowerment and women's rights, I was very frightened by it because I think it sends a very dangerous message to people who read it.
I remember Norman Mailer writing about it in Vanity Fair, and Mailer gave Brett a certain amount of credit for ambition, but ultimately he felt that the violence was gratuitous and it wasn't really justified and so on. And Mailer's was one of the nicest reviews. After that, they were just really, really negative.
All of my publishers that dumped me across the world, all of them, including America, and the only ones that didn't were UK. UK kept me, but my 26 other publishers across the world dumped me. I understood that people could be offended by the book. I wasn't. I'm not offended by art. No, art doesn't offend me. I don't look at art that way. I don't look at it as like a moral thing.
It is ironic that people are reading this book and just taking it on a purely surface level, who are just complaining about the violence or the combination of violence and sex that's in the book, and not finding any meaning in any of that. And I mean that's their choice, I suppose. I mean, they can or they can't, but I think it's implicitly there. I mean, I think it's very strongly there.
I was tired. And I also really didn't know what to say because the response was so controversial and the negativity toward the book was so loud. What was I going to say that was going to matter at all? Nothing. Nothing was going to matter. That wasn't the narrative of the book. The narrative of the book was what they wanted it to be and what the New York Times wanted it to be. And, you know, so they ran with it. I didn't care.
I sound old-fashioned, but I'm telling you it's the truth. There has to be a moral core to what you're writing. Otherwise, it's a waste of time. You don't, by which I mean you don't have to be a teacher, and you don't have to be a preacher, certainly, and talk about this way to behave and that way to behave. But somewhere in the writer's heart, there has to be, I want the world to be a better place as a result of this.
I'm not a role model, and I would say that I like to be offensive to a degree. I like to jump into other areas that writers don't. But just because I like to do it, I don't think it's something I force myself to do. I don't know. It's hard to explain why you write the books you write. You just write them because you want to. I mean, change the world. How do you do that really as a writer? I think you can change individuals' idea of the world in terms of maybe inspiring them. And if you can do that, I guess that's cool. But novels are very, very personal. It's a very interior thing that you're doing. It's not about anybody else. It's not about an audience. It's not about other readers. It's about something that you're working out within yourself that's often dealing with pain. And you kind of want to rid yourself of it.
Je ne sais plus quel écrivain avait dit que ce qui pouvait arriver de pire, c'était d'être prisonnier du cauchemar de quelqu'un d'autre. Eh bien, je pense que c'est un peu la sensation, si je me souviens bien, qu'on éprouvait en se plongeant dans ce livre. C'est pas mes cauchemars à moi, ce sont ses cauchemars à lui, mais il me les impose d'une certaine manière, vous voyez. Et à la fois, on a envie d'en sortir, parce que c'est pénible, et en même temps, on est comme secrètement attiré. Et c'est ça la force de ce livre.
Je crois que la littérature est là pour nous confronter à l'horreur. C'est même pas qu'elle peut, c'est qu'elle doit. Si ce ne sont pas les écrivains qui nous parlent de l'horreur du monde et de l'horreur en nous, qui va le faire?
The book is some sort of bomb that went off in the middle of, polite society. Through the lens of this character, Patrick Bateman, such terrible things were said and done to other social groups that were clearly not in the dominant master class, right? It was clearly like a white, male, rich perspective on the rest of the world. So I'm a literature professor, so I think that might be a bit of a barrier, or not a barrier, but a cushion almost between my reading of the book and experience of the book than just maybe a more casual reader. But I will say, I wasn't particularly offended, and I didn't see the book as some sort of insult to me personally, either as a woman or as a person of color. I saw it as an exercise in provocation that went absolutely as far as it possibly could. He used this character very effectively, in fact, to undo all the values or lack of values that were lying beneath the surface.
Si votre peau vous semble desséchée, grumeleuse, ce qui fait paraître votre visage terne et plus âgé, utilisez une lotion clarifiante qui, en vous débarrassant des petites peaux mortes, vous laisse un épiderme éclatant.
This is our Pac-Man phone. You open them up, hold them to your ear, and talk into them.
Je verse mon jus de pamplemousse citron dans un des verres à pied Saint-Rémy. Aligné à côté du four à pain Panasonic et de la cafetière Salton, se trouve le percolateur Crébina en argent massif. Aujourd'hui, je porte un costume Alan Flosser. Il date des années 80. Le modèle que l'on préférera possède des épaules larges, mais naturelles. Une poitrine ample et un dos à soufflet. Les revers souples devront être larges de 12 cm environ, la pointe du revers s'arrêtant aux 3/4 de la largeur.
The idea that the I character can, you know, kind of do a scan of a room and identify every article of clothing, the brand, and identify the brand of every object of furniture, from the candles to the fork to the handkerchief the guy takes out of his pocket. That's absurd. It's absolutely absurd. And it's a point that's being made, right? This hyper-consciousness, this hyper-consumerism, this hyper-materiality and narcissism. Fine, like that point is belabored ad infinitum. And he's a good writer, Ellis, so he knew this wasn't a mistake in style. And I bet his editors were all over him to streamline, cut down, maybe we don't need this. I'm assuming that was a battle that never stopped being fought.
Clearly, American Psycho had been edited in some way, shape, or form, but not by me. I knew at the time it was the most ghastly situation for Brett, because he'd already gone through the editing. I never saw what the editor suggested or anything. He'd gone through the copy editing, which is the last kind of paper grading procedure. He'd gone through all this once, and now he has to do it again? Well, tough luck. I don't publish books that somebody else has edited.
I mean, I do turn in books that I think are final drafts. I do not turn in a first draft and ask for help. I turn in a final draft. That's what I turn in. That's what I've always turned in. I can imagine Gary, knowing his taste, reading that and going, what are we going to do with this? And so what he did was he took it and tried to edit it like it was, tried to turn it into a quote-unquote mainstream novel. Wasn't going to happen. Wasn't going to work. And when I first saw the, 25 or 30 pages, I said, oh, what are we going to do?
We wanted to put it on sale as soon as possible to give people a chance to read the book. So I flew out there so that we could speed it up a little bit by, sitting in the same room. And a friend of mine got me a very good deal at the Bel Air so that we could be, driving each other crazy for without losing any time. In this book, what is the writer doing best, and where is he or she not quite getting to the best level? I just edit all books the same way, line by line.
He would just be editing, and then I'd be getting and go stat, 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 stat. He was very frustrated. We were editing on the way to the airport. And then he wrote me a letter a couple weeks later, said, you will be very embarrassed by this book in 10 years. And I tried my best to help you. That's what I do as an editor. And I think this book would benefit greatly from that. For many readers, Gary is right. Many readers who did not like the book, or still did not like the book, would probably have wished that Gary was the guiding force on it. Wasn't my book. Sorry guys, not what I wanted to do. This is what I wanted to do.
Can we go now?
We're not through yet. I like to dissect girls. Did you know I'm utterly insane?
And the book sold, and it kept selling for that decade. And then the movie came out, and the movie really gave the book a second life.
I had to kill a lot of people!
Christian Bale did give a kind of indelible performance. And, he did put a face onto that character.
When I read it, I was angry at it, but I kept reading, not just because I had to, but because I just kind of couldn't believe what I was reading, and almost like you get me halfway through it and I'm like, this has to have cultural meaning. There's something about it that it begs for your commitment. And if you read the whole thing and say, that was disgusting or that was pointless, you're disgusting and pointless because you just engaged with it. Director Mary Herron said to me, I've been approached to adapt this novel. I know you're gonna hate it. And so she said, bear with me. This can be an incredible feminist satire. And I 100% agreed with her. Then I suddenly remembered going to other colleges where there were bros, and frats and this sort of intense sense of entitlement. just certain kind of guys who just came from money and had this kind of I rule the world vibe. But that's just what we now know as toxic masculinity. So my relationship to the actual physical, technical, literal world was 0. My relationship to asshole men, 100%.
Let me just, so let's just get sort of, you like the movie.
Yeah, I actually
because you
do
reviewed
like
it
the
for
movie.
Gear magazine.
I think it clarified the themes of the novel. It clarified that the novel was actually a critique of male behavior. I think a lot of people don't realize that, who haven't read the book. And so it clarified that and also brought the humor of the book up to the surface. A lot of people also, I think, who are afraid of the novel, who haven't read the novel, don't understand that it's basically a comedy. I think the initial misreading of the book came from people who assumed that the book was all about violence, when actually, if you add up the violent sequences in this book, you're going to get about 4 pages, and you're going to have basically 396 pages of lists and social satire and stuff going on in Patrick Bateman's head. So to me, it was never really a book about violence.
L'odeur du sang s'infiltre dans mes rêves. Des rêves effrayants pour la plupart. Un transatlantique prend feu. Éruption volcanique à Hawaï. Mort violente de la plupart des agents de change de Salomon. James Robinson me cause du tort. Retour au pensionnat puis à Harvard. Les morts se lèvent et marchent au milieu des vivants. Mes rêves, en un film interminable, une pellicule éternellement déroulée, accident de voiture, désastre, chaise électrique et suicide horrible, seringue, pin-up mutilé, soucoupe volante.
Bret Easton Ellis est un grand écrivain de l'hallucination. À la fois l'hallucination en raison de la drogue chez ces personnages, qui sont toujours entre 2 états, mais hallucination aussi dans la perception du monde. À partir du moment où vous introduisez dans un livre l'hallucination, vous introduisez un dispositif de doute constant. Si quelqu'un voit la réalité transformée, quelle devient sa crédibilité ? Or, Bateman, manifestement, souffre d'hallucination. Le véritable résumé du livre n'est pas ce qu'on lit souvent, l'histoire d'un trader qui est à la bourse le jour et qui, la nuit, commet des meurtres. C'est le livre sur quelqu'un qui est malade et qui imagine qu'il a commis des meurtres, qu'il les a peut-être commis, mais l'indécidabilité est vraiment le cœur du livre. Est-ce que ceci s'est passé? Est-ce que ceci ne s'est pas passé? On peut lire le livre de cette manière, on peut le lire aussi d'une autre manière. C'est précisément l'objet de la littérature que l'indécidabilité.
I'd never read anything like it. I really had never yet in my life come across a book that that almost defied me to read it. That almost did everything in its power to make itself unreadable. And I was really taken by that unusual experience as a reader. Between the endless lists of things that corresponded actually in a very coherent literary way with the meticulous detail in the most brutal scenes of murder and torture, you could see what this author was trying to do. That being said, I have never liked the book. I have never enjoyed the book. I don't know. I'm almost curious about who enjoys the book. Not like who could enjoy the book, but I'm curious about what someone who really enjoys the book enjoys about the book. Like what pleasure feelings.
I was thinking when I threw away the other version, how do you find the literary equivalent on the page of madness without saying Patrick Bateman was going crazy? How do you do it in a style? And that was one of the things that I was very interested in, and that kept me obsessed. Well, repetition, fantasy, mistaking people for other people, not quite hearing the conversation correctly. How do I put this on the page? And how do I get a reflection of a madman's personality and sensibility on a page as a writer, in his voice? And so that was very interesting to do. And also, how do you make boredom interesting? Or do you make boredom interesting? Do you challenge the reader? Do you offer 4 long paragraphs of description of clothing? Well, does the reader read it or does he skip it? I thought that was interesting. Oh, yeah, maybe you do skip it. Maybe I'll just make it so boring here that you'll skip it. So there are a lot of things that I was interested in doing with American Psycho when I was 26, 25, whatever age I was, that I am definitely sure I would not be interested in now. But you know, you were younger. I wanted to take some risks.
Je possédais tous les attributs d'un être humain, la chair, le sang, la peau, les cheveux. Mais ma dépersonnalisation était si profonde, avait été menée si loin que ma capacité normale à ressentir de la compassion avait été annihilée, lentement, consciencieusement effacée. Je n'étais qu'une imitation, la grossière contrefaçon d'un être humain.
Qui est Patrick Bateman? De toute évidence, comme le titre l'indique, il faut le situer dans le personnage du psychopathe. Dans les années 70, on a commencé à identifier un type de personnalité, pas vraiment une maladie mentale, mais un type de personnalité qui remplissait certains critères spécifiques, l'absence d'émotion, une tendance à l'impulsivité, narcissisme complètement débridé, une incapacité à maintenir des relations sociales sincères et honnêtes. Bref, le portrait très négatif d'un personnage très inquiétant. Un des effets intéressants du succès d'American Psycho, c'est qu'il a mis un peu sur la carte ce lien entre monde normal et psychopathe qui n'a pas été appréhendé par la justice, qui évolue librement dans son milieu. Donc dans la finance, dans le commerce en général, aussi dans la politique, il se trouve que les psychopathes dans la population sont relativement rares, on trouve entre 3 et 5%. Dans le milieu de l'entreprise, ce chiffre semble monter jusqu'à 10-15%. Et il monte à mesure qu'on grimpe les échelons de la hiérarchie, en fait. Ce qui suggère qu'on vit dans un monde, et je pense que c'est aussi un des messages d'American Psycho, qui est fait de telle sorte qui favorise et qui récompense certains traits psychopathiques. On est tous un peu complices. Est-ce que véritablement un psychopathe peut faire le mal qu'il fait s'il n'est pas un peu aidé par l'environnement dans lequel il est, s'il ne peut pas s'y fondre facilement, passer inaperçu, facilement cacher ses traces, et dans le fond profiter d'une certaine complicité du fait que les gens ne font pas attention, qu'ils détournent le regard ou qui jouent le jeu parce que ça les arrange.
American Psycho was very prescient in a lot of ways. Trump is quite a figure in American Psycho. He was a representation of the sort of corrupt and farcical side of American business, I think. You know, Patrick Bateman seems to admire Trump a great deal, which I think is kind of, you know, it tells you a lot about Donald Trump, that a serial killer is his biggest fan. You know?
Money is great. White establishment power is great. Minorities of any kind, including just poor people, that's not great. We don't want any of that. And now there's a more radical divide even than American Psycho times.
Obviously, Bret Easton Ellis saw things endemic to American society, to capitalist society, to relationships between men and women, between wealthy and poorer people, between people of different races. So many of the things that we're grappling with in 2021 are the things, the seeds of which were already there in '91 that Easton Ellis saw. American being psychopathic, right? It's a throwaway and it's a very cool and catchy title, but it really is asking, like, what is sick about this society?
I
think it took a long time for readers to understand what the book was. And I think at the beginning, it had a kind of cult following because of the violence and the gore and so on. I think that was mistaken, but at least it kept the book alive. So over time, I think people have come to understand that the book is not a violent book. I mean, it has violence in it, but it's not about violence. It's about a culture that's rotting from within.
Judith Martin, also known as Miss Manners. Welcome to Policy Watch.
I collect a lot of epitaphs when I'm working on a book. This one that I was haunted by that I kind of thought I wouldn't use, maybe it's too strange, by Miss Manners, who was the etiquette lady. And for some reason, the more I got into finishing the book, the more that quote began to stick, and it just felt like the right way to go.
Well, one of the major mistakes people make is that they think manners are only the expression of happy ideas. There's a whole range of behavior that can be expressed in a mannerly way. That's what civilization is all about. There have to be some restraints. If we followed every impulse, we'd be killing one another. And that's true. I mean, she's right about that. And I mean, I don't think she is literally talking about murder. She's just talking about wiping people away, blacklisting people, canceling people. American Psycho seems to take place in a kind of wild, free time in a way compared to where we are now. But it's, and I think if I wrote a novel now, it would be much more critical of the society than American Psycho was.
Somebody said that American Psycho is now like a respectable book.
I guess they mean that if you're around long enough, for 30 years, then you become respectable. Like whatever, the old whore. If you're a whore long enough and you get to be old, you end up becoming respectable. So, but I don't know. I don't care really to a degree. I'm not looking to be respected, and I'm not looking for my books to be considered respectable. But it's it has been around for a long time. We'll see how much longer it will be around, but yeah.